This WebEx call is being recorded and may be posted on DOE's website or used internally, or it may be used by supporting organizations of this side event. If you do not wish to have your voice recorded, please do not speak during the call. If you do not wish to have your image recorded, please turn off your camera or participate by phone. If you speak during the call or use a video connection, you are presumed to consent to recording and use of your voice or image. Thank you. Now let's begin. I am Facundo De Lucci, Steering Group Vice Chair of the International Framework for Nuclear Energy Cooperation, or IFNEC, which represents 65 countries. I am also here today representing the 13 participant countries and 17 partner organizations of the Nuclear Innovation Clean Energy Future, also called NICE Future Initiative. I like this nickname. I will share a few perspectives from these two organizations in a moment. But first, let me thank our organizer and co-sponsors. This side event on the International Atomic Energy Agency IAEA 65th General Conference is presented by the United States in partnership with what I personally consider some of the more dynamic, flexible, innovative fora within the nuclear community, such as IFNEC, NICE Future, the International Youth Nuclear Congress, also known as IYNC, and Women in Nuclear, that is US and Global. I encourage you to visit these organizations' websites to learn more about the great work they are doing to advance nuclear innovation. Today, we will discuss the roles of nuclear innovation in just and a clean transition. We will address groundbreaking advances in technologies. If they are deployed, these technologies can quickly accelerate solutions toward net zero. Please use the chat to share comments or questions. We will try to address a few audience questions, time permitting. I want to take a moment to share with you some quick highlights on behalf of IFNEC and NICE Future. Our speakers will talk about women and IYNC later in this program. I believe in many respects our goals are shared. As we approach COP26, we know we must come together in pursuit of clean energy. We all know that nuclear power produces about a third of global emissions-free electricity. It has always been the sources. It is not only emissions-free, like solar and wind, but it is also a 24/7 reliable energy source. For countries, nuclear energy, working in tandem with other clean energy sources like renewable energy, could be key to reaching our ambitious goals for reducing carbon emissions by the end of the decade. We know that if we work together to accelerate the use of these new technologies, we have clean energy solutions that can ultimately electrify the corners of the world, uplift the lives of women and men from different backgrounds, and help address issues of equity. But what can governments do to support accelerated transitions to nuclear? In this regard, IFNEC provides a forum for cooperation to explore beneficial approaches to ensure the use of nuclear energy for peaceful purposes proceeds in a manner that is efficient and meets the highest standards of safety, security, and non-proliferation by bringing together an international network of technical expertise. Currently, the work of IFNEC has identified financing of nuclear projects and the role of current and future technology development as a main priority. In addition to that, IFNEC, through its working groups, is focused on three main areas: infrastructure development, looking to identify areas of global infrastructure that could be improved through international cooperation in order to support the development of the physical, organizational, and legislative infrastructure; on reliable nuclear fuel services to enhance reliable, commercially based front and back-end fuel services that provide options for developing nuclear energy while reducing the risk of nuclear proliferation, particularly addressing the back end of the nuclear fuel cycle, furthering the potential for shared multinational solutions to the challenges facing member countries, and on the challenges posed by the arrival of new supplier and customer countries and the new spheres of interaction between them to analyze the current situation and relationship between supplier and customer countries, establish a common working ground, and set up a reliable and trustworthy discussion environment in order to identify, discuss, and propose actions to be taken by supplier and customer countries. I want to take also a moment to highlight NICE Future, another multi-governmental effort. It is the only nuclear energy initiative of what's known as the Clean Energy Ministerial, also known as CEM. I believe this initiative has had a huge impact in changing how people think about nuclear energy. While nuclear is a workhorse of clean energy, it took 9 ministerial meetings before nuclear was accepted as a work stream in the CEM. Now, thanks to the efforts of NICE Future, global leaders and policymakers increasingly are recognizing that nuclear energy and its many innovations and uses can be vital in many countries' national pathways to net zero. I invite you to hear more about some innovations that nuclear energy can provide within a clean energy system, all on the NICE Future and IFNEC website. You can use the link that was provided on the flyer that nuclear energy can provide. Please read our publications, Breakthroughs, Nuclear Innovation in a Clean Energy System, and most recently, Pathways to Net Zero Using Nuclear Innovation. You can also replay minister-level discussions at CEM 12. These are all on the website. Nuclear has the potential for many different uses and applications, both electric and non-electric, for process heat, for desalination, for hydrogen. These are exciting and in many cases transformational. Both NICE Future and IFNEC are working with many countries around the world to help exchange information on a range of clean technology and system options. From the NICE Future perspective, this work has included multi-governmental work on advanced modeling, and from the IFNEC side, the work has included new financing and contractual schemes to link the technology development with appropriate infrastructural needs. Now, I will turn to our speaker, Sean Korek, who will speak about transformative innovations on the horizon and accelerated pathways for clean energy using nuclear innovation. Sean is Senior Vice President for Policy and Public Affairs at the Nuclear Energy Institute. He has an extended experience that includes being responsible for U.S. Department of Energy's research efforts on current and future nuclear energy systems, maintaining the government's nuclear energy research infrastructure, establishing a path forward for the nation's spent nuclear fuel and high-level nuclear waste management program, and a host of other national priorities during his role as Acting Assistant Secretary for Nuclear Energy in the U.S. DOE. Sean, we are excited to hear how advanced nuclear technologies are transformational. Sean, the floor is yours.
Fantastic. Thanks very much for that kind introduction, and thanks to the organizers for the opportunity to be here. It really is an exciting time for nuclear, and it's really my privilege to get a chance to speak with you this morning. I want to talk this morning about the transformation that we're seeing in the innovation that's being brought to bear. I want to start with why that's happening, certainly why that's being enabled here in the U.S. context. First, just a little bit about us at the Nuclear Energy Institute. We're the trade association for the nuclear technologies industry here in the U.S. We've got more than 300 members from 17 countries, most of the big U.S. nuclear operators, but also the innovators, national lab, university members, as well as suppliers and vendors in the nuclear sector, all of which are really excited about the innovation that's going on in nuclear and the opportunity it presents. I want to start by talking about the growing recognition of the value of nuclear and how that's leading to the investments that we're seeing made in nuclear innovation and what that can mean for the future of the technology. Here in the US, there has been a significant increase, I'd say, in the recognition of the value of nuclear. It really stems from the recognition of the importance of having firm, clean generation, right? So it was said at the outset, having that 24/7 operational availability for nuclear to complement rising shares of wind, solar, and storage and the decarbonized grid brings tremendous value. And more and more organizations in the US have really done the math, right? So whether it's the committees in our Congress, our federal agencies, state governments, NGOs, universities, and the utilities that are ultimately going to be responsible for providing around-the-clock clean electricity, they've all looked at what it's going to take to get there, and they've concluded that having things like nuclear that are available around the clock and also carbon-free can really make a huge difference in getting to an affordable, reliable, decarbonized grid. It's really led to a greater awareness as well of what we call the cost versus value discussion, right? Some folks will talk about how things like wind and solar can be brought to the grid at a very low life cycle cost or levelized cost. Well, that may be true, but you also need something that's firm and clean to back that up. And nuclear can play that role. And even if nuclear doesn't win on an LCOE comparison, the value that it delivers to the grid means you get to a decarbonized grid faster and at lower cost and with greater reliability by having nuclear on the system. That's getting policymakers to want to invest more in nuclear. As are other attributes, right? The relatively small footprint, the relatively low raw material input requirements, as people get more and more concerned about what rising shares of clean energy are going to mean for mining, for critical minerals, for example, around the world. Nuclear has real advantages in that space, has very important advantages in the creation of well-paying long-term jobs that are increasingly part of the clean energy discussion here in the US. And then, the ability, as was mentioned earlier, to help decarbonize beyond the grid. The fact that nuclear can help address the 2/3 to 3/4 of emissions that come outside of the electric sector is really making a difference in the attitudes of policymakers and decision makers here in the United States. The result has been very strong support for nuclear across nearly all of the US political spectrum. I personally couldn't be happier with the support we've seen from the Biden-Harris administration on nuclear. Nuclear is also one of the rare areas of bipartisan agreement in our Congress on clean energy. You look at things like the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which has been negotiated between our two major political parties here in the United States, and it includes very significant advances or investments in nuclear. Grants to ensure that we don't shut down any more well-run nuclear power plants for economic reasons. Big investments in what we call the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program, which I'll get into later. Even investments in using nuclear to demonstrate large-scale hydrogen production. All told, there's something on the order of $10 billion of investment in nuclear in this big bipartisan bill. Even a more partisan piece of legislation, the reconciliation bill, which is being developed by the Democrats in our Congress and in the White House, include very significant investments in, for example, a production tax credit, also designed to ensure that we don't shut down any more well-run nuclear plants, but also significant investments in R&D infrastructure, both in maintaining what we currently have and adding new capability to help accelerate nuclear innovation. Those are all parts of these efforts that are underway, and these investments that we're seeing in our Congress and our administration. As a result, these federal programs are really helping to accelerate key innovations that I think are going to lead to a bright future for nuclear in the U.S. and around the world. So starting with our current reactors, I talked about the importance of those and maintaining their operation. Well, we've seen investments in over the years in upgrading the power output and improved capacity factors that have been enabled by technological advances. Here in the U.S., we've added the equivalent of more than 30 reactors worth of generating capacity just by running our reactors better and at higher power levels, right? We've also seen that there's a demonstrated technical basis to operate those plants safely out to at least 80 years. As people may know, nearly all of the 93 operating nuclear plants in the US have been approved to operate out to 60 years, and several have already received approval to operate out to 80. We expect more than half of the plants in the US to file for what we call call subsequent license renewal to operate up to 80 years by the end of this decade. Huge interest in retaining those existing plants. And we're also seeing advanced fuels being developed for today's plants that offer the potential for even greater efficiency and safety. So a lot of innovation has been going on with our current plants. What you may have heard even more about is the innovation that's going on with advanced reactors, the next generation of reactors. We've got dozens of U.S. firms that are investing today in bringing next generation nuclear reactor designs to markets. It starts with water-cooled small modular reactors that build on 60 years of operating and construction experience here in the U.S. and that promise faster construction times and lower overall costs. We also are seeing significant investments in higher temperature reactors, reactors cooled with gases, with liquid metals, with molten salts. Again, offering the potential to not just produce large quantities of electricity, but also to help decarbonize beyond the grid. And then finally, we're seeing innovations in things like heat storage with the Natrium design being brought forward by TerraPower and GE Hitachi, or the increased load following capabilities in the NuScale design. Innovations that will help next generation nuclear mesh even better in a grid that includes increasing shares of wind, solar, and storage. So all of these innovations have been made possible by the U.S. government working with our private sector in recognition of the value that nuclear energy brings today and can bring going forward. We're also seeing other important supports that I think are worth highlighting. Our government has provided the loan guarantees that have helped get the Vogtle reactors under construction in our state of Georgia near to completion and planning to go into operation next year. We've seen production tax credits advanced for new construction. We expect to see, or hope to see more of that going forward. We've certainly seen our government engaging in things like export financing, trade advocacy, and using other tools that frankly have been used to grow a very robust renewable sector here in the U.S. and they're being used increasingly to ensure that we have a strong nuclear energy sector as well. As a result of all these innovations and the support that we've seen, nuclear energy is now a major part of our utility plans, our state policies, and our federal decarbonization plans. So, for example, look at our utilities. We've got very major electricity producers like Duke, which has declared it's going to get to carbon neutral by 2050. They've said that a central part of their plan is keeping their 11 reactors operating out to 80 years. Dominion, another big utility here in our state of Virginia, is planning on relicensing all 4 of their reactors, again, to meet their decarbonization plan. We've even got utility companies that don't currently operate nuclear plants like Pacificor, which is working with TerraPower to demonstrate the Natrium design, or UAMPS, which is a coalition of municipal utilities in the Intermountain West planning to build the NuScale design. They're doing this to replace coal and to ensure that they can continue to provide reliable, affordable electricity supplies as coal becomes an increasingly small part of electricity generation here in the U.S. And as a final thought, I should also mention it's not just the innovators and the utilities in the U.S. that are talking nuclear. Workers and community leaders have been spearheading efforts in the United States to keep nuclear on the agenda. So, of course, long-term, well-paying jobs are a central part of President Biden's Build Back Better agenda. And one of the great things about nuclear is it does create those well-paying long-term jobs, particularly in the communities that host the facilities. So as a result, what we've seen is that it's been communities that have been leading the fight to preserve today's nuclear generation. Communities are increasingly getting interested in what new nuclear can mean going forward. In particular, in something that we refer to as the coal to nuclear transition opportunity. There's a chance for communities that are facing the loss of an existing coal plant to now look at new nuclear as an opportunity to not just reuse the site where the coal plant exists, but also to preserve the well-paying jobs. Once you get beyond the nuclear island in a nuclear plant, the steam system looks a whole lot like the steam system in a coal plant. And the types of skill set it takes to run a coal plant can be very readily transferred to a new nuclear plant. That's got communities like, for example, the communities in Wyoming that are looking at potentially hosting the TerraPower reactor. As you may know, there are actually 4 communities that are looking at the closure of a coal plant this decade that are being investigated as potential hosts for the Natrium reactor. All 4 communities want that, want to be awarded the siting of that reactor. We're seeing a similar interest in other states, where again, communities are looking at the potential closure of a coal plant or planned closure of a coal plant. State officials in Wyoming, for example, have passed a law calling for the study of replacing a big coal plant in that state with a nuclear plant. So we're seeing this interest growing in states among elected officials for nuclear to really help preserve jobs while maintaining grid reliability and affordability. So my bottom line is we have an opportunity today for nuclear that looks brighter than I think we've had since nuclear first came on the scene. But we need to learn from what's worked and frankly what hasn't. And our panel today can offer some great insights as to how the nuclear energy can learn from its history and how the many benefits of nuclear can be used to uplift whole communities. So with that, let me hand things over to Johnsy, and I look forward to the rest of this discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, John, for that great presentation. Let me, before moving to the panel, let me take a comment from the audience that I think it will give us the possibility to sum up some of the many elements you introduced in your presentation. It's that the political outlook for nuclear energy in the US seems to have changed considerably over the past 5 to 10 years. So how could you sum up, taking into account some of the elements you mentioned, to explain what has happened?
Yeah, so I think it's multifold. I think we have had a segment of the climate community in the US, and Susie knows this very well, that has, as I said earlier, done the math and has gone to policymakers to say, hey, nuclear is really important. If we shut down any more nuclear plants, we're taking steps backward. We need something that's firm and clean at 24/7 going forward. Nuclear can play that role. There are new technologies that are coming to market that offer improvements in safety and economics. Let's invest in those, right? That opened a conversation on Capitol Hill that then came around to providing support both for research and development programs and for policies that have increasingly embraced nuclear. So that's been a part of it. I mentioned communities. The fact that community leaders have stood up and said, we really value this nuclear plant in our backyard, that's made a big difference. And then frankly, I think the industry has done a better job of telling its story. When I got into the industry, they frankly tended to be media averse. We're being a lot more aggressive about telling our story. And then finally, I think there's a whole generation of younger people who are coming into this industry with a different perspective, right? And they're helping open eyes, particularly among their peers, in ways that have really made a difference, I think, with the political leadership. And we're going to hear from some of those folks here today. So thanks, great question.
Thank you, Sean. I think that your talk provided us with some important insights about roles for nuclear power, especially as the world looks to COP26. Next, we have this excellent panel. I will turn to it, and there will be further opportunity for questions in these discussions. Sean, we invite you to please stay with us for this discussion. And this panel is directly connected to what you mentioned, and I am delighted to introduce Jansi Kandasamy, who will lead our next discussion. Jansi joined GE in September 2015 as Vice President of Engineering, having overall responsibility for operating nuclear plant technical support, modification, design, and new small modular plant design and development. In the last 30 years, Jansi has held positions in virtually all the disciplines of the nuclear power industry, and she has combined this professional activity with an active participation at different levels of women in nuclear initiatives that includes being the past chair of the US chapter of WIN. For those of you who already know her, I am sure her presence is a guarantee of an exciting conversation. For the rest, I can tell you that this promises to be a great session with issues that are vitally important. How can nuclear energy lift up the lives of communities? How can nuclear advance the lives of women or girls? How can we prepare a diverse and talented next generation of leaders to lead the way to a clean energy future? Shanzi, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Facundo. Appreciate that introduction. Now you've set the stage for, oh my gosh, am I going to do this well? But thank you for that. I appreciate that. And John, I always enjoy your speeches. I think this was no exception. Really enjoy hearing you talk about all the great things. And, you know, these are exciting times. And hearing you talk about transformative innovations and such as continuing plants that are continuing to operate. We've heard some good news from Illinois, advanced reactors, the financial support, and the administration, I think, starting to see the importance of nuclear really gives me hope. You know, for me, growing up in the nuclear industry and addressing the need for communities to understand not only the technical design, but also to make sure that, and I loved what you said about thinking about a coal plant, the system operation is no different than a nuclear power plant operations. And it's really on how we're operating it. So I appreciate you saying that. I think it's important from a community involvement, getting people to understand what this is. This isn't just some buzzwords, but really for people to understand from a safety perspective, what's out there. So there's a lot of communication that needs to be involved in this race to net zero. So thank you, John. I appreciate that and really enjoyed that. I am really thrilled to be representing US Wind and Wind Global, and really delighted to be here today with members of these phenomenal nuclear organizations that are leading the way in a just transition. And I'm especially honored to be included on the same stage with these two amazing, brilliant young women that are going to be leading the charge into the future. And it's really like being invited to go out with my daughter and hanging out with her, like, oh my God, you're including me. And I was reading some comments from Christine about, you know, trying to get more young people involved on the stage and push the seniors out. No, just kidding. But I appreciate that. And I think we do need to hear to the young. I think to be able to move forward, we're building their future. They're building their future. So I think this is pretty exciting. And of course, talk about a nice future, right? I love that. I think it's got a great ring to it, a nice future, right? Regardless of nuclear innovation for clean energy, it's really about the nice future. So pretty cool, I think. So with me today, I have Susie Baker, the co-founder of Good Energy Collective and creative director of the Fastest Path to Zero initiative at University of Michigan. Really looking forward to hearing that and how more about that with Susie. And we also have Christine Madden, who's the immediate past chair of climate change, IYNC, International Youth Nuclear Congress. I'm not going to read their bios. We included that as part of this. I really want to jump right into it and spend more time talking about these initiatives and all these accomplishments and their perspectives of where we are and this race to net zero. So the pandemic has really forced us to do things differently, look at things differently, and really brought into the light the need for nuclear in the mix in the race for net zero. It's exciting that Illinois' energy bill was passed, allowing the Illinois plants to continue to run, recognize the value that they bring. We were able to conduct our last two national conferences, US Wind, very successfully virtually. And, you know, part of these conferences is networking. And we were able to be creative in providing opportunities for networking rather than just go through the sessions in the virtual conference. And in October, the U.S. Wind Global Conference is going to be conducted virtually, and I hope you're able to attend. So I was part of the young members of Wind Global. They prepared a video on COP26. Hope you get to see it. It's on YouTube. It's Net Zero Needs Nuclear. So it just talks about it's a minute and a half, kind of is impactful from the Wind Global leaders. So before the pandemic, I remember seeing a lot of pictures and actually being in India also, large populated areas, cities, where you couldn't actually see the hand in front of your face because of the smog. I mean, China, I don't know if you've seen pictures of that before the pandemic. And several days after we were forced to shut down. So I'm giving you a visual of, that same spot, looking at those same locations in the cities. And you look at those pictures, it's like, wow, what beautiful architecture, what beautiful plants. And this is when, after the factories were told to shut down, people couldn't drive into work. And so we didn't have a lot of cars out on the streets. These locations were beautiful and clear, and the skies were blue. And I think the measurement of carbon emissions was almost down to nothing. I mean, that was just like an eye opener when you look at the before and after. You could say, well, there's no, these are the silver linings that I look at when people talk about different things that are happening in the pandemic. Is really, that was like a big silver lining, I would say. And then when I was in India several years ago, there was continuous blackouts and brownouts, and that was because of electricity. You have these villages that still have candles or sitting by the fire in their kitchen, and then they planned their days, their siestas, and nap times when the power was out and the factories had to shut down and you didn't have electricity. And then this village where my parents are is about an hour away from these two plants that were built, nuclear plants that were built. And the plants are about 1,000 megawatts. And recently, about 2 years ago, when I went back, we had power 24/7. And I was all excited, like, oh my gosh, we got nuclear power plants here. We have 24/7 dependable, reliable power, and we don't have to worry about the brownouts and blackouts, but continuation. But there was a lot that went into it. When the fuel was delivered, there were people that were paid to go running around scaring people. The social media with, oh, remember what happened at Chernobyl, remember what happened at Fukushima, remember, scaring the people to be running around, and they would have all these protests in front of the gates. So they couldn't load fuel. The fuel was there ready to go. But, that's all from a fear of what's being communicated, not understanding. For me, growing up in nuclear my entire career, living out within a 5-mile emergency preparedness zone, having children in that zone, and being there for over 30 years, I could say I wouldn't live there if I was worried about it. I believe in it, and I'm a strong supporter of that. So, now we're looking at nuclear-powered rocket ships, microreactors that could sit on a flatbed and go to anywhere and provide power for medical facilities that are mobile. And the numerous technologies that are affording jobs while keeping carbon emissions down. So John mentioned 2/3 of nuclear energy is offsetting carbon emissions. I mean, that's true when you look at, as I mentioned, that visual that I provided early on. Now, I don't know if you watched the movie Independence Day with Will Smith, the aliens attacking the world. When you talk about diversity and inclusion, boy, there was no better time for everybody to get together and work together and save the planet. So the race to net zero, I don't think is any different. So we need to come together. We need to leverage the diversity of thought, diversity of knowledge, diversity of technologies, and really come together and leverage each other's strengths and lessons learned. You know, as John mentioned about how can we learn together, but this is working together to save our planet and go forward on this race to net zero. So working for GE, I'm really excited to be a part of this advanced nuclear designs. You know, John mentioned Natrium and X300 and really being a contributor to solutions and creating pathways to net zero. So now, you know, we talked about the young and the youth starting to get more involved. And I hear more and more about how different organizations are involving the workforce of the future. So our youth early on to come up with innovative ideas for their future. And I'm sure it must be challenging today with travel restrictions to increase awareness and engage people. It's not like you could be sitting on the bleachers or sitting in a plane and having conversations about this. So Christine, I know IYNC is running an innovation contest right now. Can you talk a little bit about that and how are you dealing with the challenges brought on by COVID?
Sure, thanks, Chauncey. So this is our third year running the innovation contest, which provides a platform for youth to present and discuss novel solutions that contribute to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals in nuclear science and technology. The contest itself is co-sponsored by IYNC with local, regional, young generation and nuclear societies, as well as other organizations like the International Atomic Energy Agency. The winners are provided with a travel grant to attend and present their idea at the IYNC Biennial Conference, which will happen next year in May in Sochi, Russia. We also provide a cash prize to the winners so they can further develop their ideas. This year, we have 3 regional conferences running in tandem right now. One is in Africa, one is in North America, and one is in Europe. It's actually the first time that North America and Europe as a whole have participated in this contest, which is exciting, not just from the perspective that more innovation is happening in the young generation, but also from the perspective that more diversity and inclusion is happening in developing new ideas. So in a typical year, we would hold these contests in person and we would actually travel to the locations where they're being held, but due to travel restrictions, we've actually had to move to an online platform, which actually has had the benefit of, we've seen increased participation. And so while we recognize the value of in-person discussions and collaboration, we're also taking away from this experience the need to pursue hybrid, online, and in-person events to be more inclusive in our approach going forward. And so moving forward, we hope that this change will allow our networks to collaborate through multidisciplinary and multicultural teams, as we believe diversity is key to innovation. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. I love that. I think that is so cool, and coming up with different ways to bring people together with some innovations. Amazing. Thank you for that. Susie, in the mission of the FAST Path, I would think you need community involvement to support and engage it. And there's a lot that goes on, right? So you can't just have a plan and just expect it to go execute. You really need the community support. And I would say you and I have something in common. I love to paint and build things, and I think it's really cool that you worked as an art teacher at a pediatric oncology hospital. I think that's so cool. And your creative side must surely help not only to conceptualize, but communicate it effectively. Can you tell us a little bit about the initiative and how can we incentivize community-led planning in the energy transition?
Gosh, that's a really good question. You know, I think John laid out for us just sort of the scale of the challenge of decarbonizing the economy and how that's going to mean that every state and every community is going to be affected by this process, right? This is an unprecedented scale and it's going to require every single tool on the tool belt. So in a way, this idea of competing between renewables or nuclear, fossil fuels and nuclear, it's sort of dissipating, and it's this realization that we're all going to be affected by this. And in this realization, there have been these really clear calls from the environmental justice movement that this transformation needs to be community-led in order to be environmentally just. And I think that that's right, but it also adds another layer of challenge, because it means not only are we doing something technologically unprecedented, we're also doing it in a totally new way that is sort of a more egalitarian approach versus a traditional hierarchical approach where we make a plan and we execute the plan. Instead, we're saying like, okay, what does everybody want for their future and how do we build that together? So a lot of the work that I do with Fastest Path at University of Michigan and the Good Energy Collective, which is a public policy organization here in Washington, D.C., is we are trying to figure out the nuts and bolts of some of these challenges. So what policies and resources are needed for communities to even be able to engage in this process? I mean, like Christine said, like, how do you even make it accessible, right? This isn't a typical experience. It's not something we've done before. So like, how do we design for that? And how do we allow communities to mobilize and lead? And John-C, to your question about creativity, I think this is where my background in the arts really comes in. This is a chance for innovation, right? This is an opportunity for inclusion. This is a chance to do things really differently. And so I think it is sort of this incredible window for creative folks to come out and help us problem solve, help us figure out how to move forward and how to decarbonize every corner of our economy. And how to do it in an environmentally just way. So yeah, while these are huge, sort of intimidating challenges, I think we've got sort of these pillars right and thinking about how to work together and how to move it forward.
Hierarchical approach, really trying to get everybody together and move forward. John, what do you think about Susie's comments and your thoughts on engaging and incentivizing communities?
Yeah, well, first of all, it's always worth listening to what Susie has to say. So thanks for that. She and I actually had an opportunity to work together, I don't know, 5-6 years ago, when we were both working in DOE on a consent-based approach to nuclear waste facility siting, for example. That experience taught some lessons about the importance of, don't start with here's what we want to go do. Start more with a conversation, right, and see what a community might feel like is in their best interests to be a part of. I think that you look at the example of the facility that that TerraPower wants to build in Wyoming with their Natrium design. They haven't said, okay, we're going to go build it here. They've said, we've got these 4 communities where coal plants are going to be shut down. Let's engage in a conversation and see where this might be a good fit. So I think some of the types of lessons that Susie's talking about, we can talk about the UAMPS project too, and the way that there's the cities and municipalities that participate in that project do so through a public process that involves their city councils and what have you. I mean, so there are a lot of things that are being done, I think, differently than they were the last time. Not to say that everything's perfect, but I do think that there is a recognition of the value of a new approach and incorporating some of the lessons that have been learned over the past couple of decades, and we're starting to see that play out with real projects right now.
Great, thanks, John. And you're right. Starting with the conversation and getting the community. I think that Wyoming example is a perfect one, and just having a conversation. It's almost like, okay, what are some of the solutions? How can we get there? So appreciate that. Thank you. Christine, I'm really impressed with how your organization has taken the lead in initiatives that focus on our youth globally to combat climate change. The theme of your last conference was diversity and inclusion. Can you talk about inclusion? What does that mean to you? And what have you done without opportunities for getting together face to face?
Sure. Yes. Thanks, Shanti. So the last conference that we hosted in Australia last year was on diversity and inclusion. And inclusion for me is providing access to opportunities and resources for people that may otherwise be excluded or marginalized. And then taking that one step further, it's also about providing an environment where people feel valued, respected, and supported. And in the last few years, we've taken significant steps to ensure equity and representation within the IYNC organization. We've expanded our travel grant program, also with assistance from the International Atomic Energy Agency, to enable individuals, particularly women and those from the Global South, to participate in IYNC events and to support their regional and local events. This has had a profound impact on the organization's work because, as a result, our volunteer base has become much more diverse and international. We've also established quotas within our committees to address disparities in both geographic and gender representation, and our representation and our value added to the international community has exploded in a very positive way. We also have fundamentally changed the way that we network and learn from one another by giving young professionals a seat at the table to discuss and find solutions to complex problems like climate change. 4 years ago, actually this week, we hosted our first GC side event with the United Arab Emirates, and the focus of the event was actually on how young leaders are driving the discussion in the nuclear sector to address climate change. So part of the strategy within our organization is to show that value add and to empower young people to be part of the conversation. And so basically, to sum it up, our goal for last year's conference was to reach gender and geographic parity and representation and across our panel sessions. And we did achieve that. And I think that that's really wonderful when you think about where we started from. And I think for an organization that operates predominantly in a male-centric Western space, IYNC has created an environment where people don't feel singled out, specifically because it's created a space that is reflective of all people, and that is empowering. And I think that it's also foundational to creating and changing an environment, and creating an environment of inclusion within the nuclear industry. And then to address your second question, as we discussed a bit earlier, we have moved to an online platform as a result of the pandemic, which initially was difficult to adjust to, but what we found actually that in engaging online, we were able to reach new populations and bring them into the fold also as volunteers. And as a result, we've been able to significantly increase our activities and our outreach.
Thank you, Christina. Appreciate that. And you're right. You know, I think before the pandemic, it was like, oh my God, it was unheard of for us to do any kind of collaborative activity, you know, without getting together face to face. But I think we're finding more and more ways for us to do that. And this is great. This is wonderful. Nothing came to a stop. We're continuing to find different ways to do things together. Susie, what does it mean for nuclear facility siting practices to center principles of equity and environmental justice? And do you have any examples of where this has been done well?
Yeah, well, Natrium has come up a couple of times now. I think they're doing a phenomenal job. And I think part of that process that is so interesting is that they started at the state level, and then they also engaged at the community level. So they had this sort of like hybrid bottom up, top down method that has, as far as I can tell so far, been working really well to make sure that they're bringing all of the critical stakeholders along in the process, and that they're not going to end up in a situation where someone is blindsided by their siting choice or was not heard early on in the process. And I think that this is something developers really are figuring out this time around. There is never a reason to site a nuclear reactor where it's not wanted. that really only leads to cost escalation, conflict escalation, and negative outcomes. And especially when there are so many communities that actively want this technology. I think, you know, the idea of transitioning fossil communities, for instance, to nuclear is extremely powerful because we have communities who know that their generation source isn't sustainable. Their identity is tied deeply to producing electricity or energy for their communities, and they have these pre-existing workforces. Often there's strong political alignment in these communities with regard to support for nuclear. And we have all of these sort of incredible potential markets and folks saying, hey, we're so interested in this. Can you help us think through it? And so when you have that kind of opportunity, I just don't think that there's ever a reason to pursue a project where you have really considerable obstacles to success, especially at the early phases. Like, we need to figure this out and get it right with partners who are really truly bought in. And we need to learn that no is also a success, right? So like, if a community engages with the nuclear sector and you get to know, like, congratulations, everyone, you are no longer throwing time, money, and resources down the drain pursuing a project that isn't going to work. So just, I think there's been some really powerful retooling of the way that we think about this process. So yeah, I mean, I think we're largely on track. I'm myself watching really closely and feeling quite positive about our ability to do this well.
That's great. That's a great point. You know, I never thought about it before that way, but you're right about getting to know is also a success. That's pretty cool, I think. You know, I mentioned earlier about in India when they built this plant and that the locals really didn't understand the benefits that they were going to receive. All they heard about was all these bad things. So there's this political influence. There's a you know, there's a financial influence, there's, you know, educating the people, and it's even worse in a country and where the locals don't even have high school degrees or college degrees or not even informed. So, you know, that's pretty cool about the community part and making sure we're doing a little bit of homework ahead of time. So I would, you know, we're getting close to the end of our session, and I would love to keep talking and going on because I think we could do this all day long. So I would say just maybe to close, 1 minute or less, what advice will you give our audience on what they can do to get the word on how nuclear energy can transform and uplift communities? Maybe it's a big ask, but if we can, Christine, give us your thoughts, Susie and John, and we can wrap up and turn it over to Facundo.
Thanks, Chauncey. So at a very fundamental level and from an international perspective, because we're, you know, in the United States, energy access isn't necessarily an issue, whereas more broadly across the globe, lots of people still don't have access to electricity, and over 1/3 of the world's population doesn't have access to clean cooking. And these inaccessibilities predominantly impact women and girls, as they usually bear the primary responsibility for household energy and also for unpaid work. So in providing them with access to clean energy sources like nuclear, opportunities to attend school can be realized. And what we've noticed at our level is that at the international level is that we really need to decouple ourselves from the nuclear silos that we have created. And we need to engage with the greater clean tech community. At the International Youth Nuclear Congress, we've actively participated in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change's youth organization, YOUNGO, for several years now. We've held workshops at their annual conference on the outskirts of Cobb. We've actually been inspired and used tools, art, as Susie has done in the US in many of these workshops. And we've also attended COB ourselves. And at the end of the day, we can't keep talking to ourselves. And fundamentally, I, like many other nuclear engineers that I know, entered this field not because we saw it as the solution, but as one solution to many in solving climate change. And in that context, in the context of these discussions that we're having, we need to bring humility and empathy, which is something I think the young generation does very well, and realize that, from an engineering perspective, there's going to be no perfect energy source. And nuclear energy is not an exception to that rule, which is why innovation is foundational to all of these organizations within the clean energy tech space. And in focusing on our similarities, like the need to mitigate climate change, and also building upon lessons learned that we can bring to and share with that community and vice versa, I think that we can make progress towards a space where all clean energy sources are valued. And it also allows, especially in the international community, we really need to address this from a policy perspective, because if nuclear energy isn't included in the clean tech energy credits, then it's going to remain inaccessible to most of the world. So having these really fundamental discussions and engaging based on similarities instead of differences, I think is really where we need to start. Thank you.
Thanks, Christine. Appreciate it. Susie, you got 30 seconds.
Yeah, well, really just to reinforce what Christine said, I think we often in the nuclear community emphasize outreach and education, which are critically important elements. But a missing link there is this piece of introspection, looking at our own practices and our own community and proactively creating a space that is welcoming to all people, where women and people of color want to work and want to be. And I think that has been just sort of this puzzle piece that we haven't quite grappled with yet. And I hope that that's sort of the next phase of evolution for this community.
Thanks, Susie. Appreciate that. John, bring us home.
Yeah, thanks. I just think it's so important for us to keep bringing the voices of the communities themselves that that host these facilities, know what they're all about, know frankly the responsibility that comes with it, but also the benefits. I think the more that we're able to help those people tell their stories, the more we're going to find a wider set of willing communities to host the facilities we're going to need to get to a clean energy system, because as Susie mentioned earlier, the task is enormous. And we're going to need all the tools in the toolkit. So thanks for a great discussion.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Christine. Thanks, Susie. I'll turn it back to Facundo.
Thanks, Nancy, and thanks to Susie, Christine, and John. I think that was a great discussion. I would also like to thank to Patrick Hughes of the DOE team. This webinar video, this side event will be made available for replay on the NICE Future website. And I think that this discussion reflected clearly some features of the present and future of nuclear energy. I mean, nuclear energy is dynamic, is flexible, is diverse, has a high level of professionality, and looks into the future as a pivotal tool, not only to address net zero goals, but also to achieve many of the sustainable development goals. It's a very powerful tool that address from a cross-cutting approach and deal with international challenges worldwide. So what was reflected in this side event, strong national public policies using or considering nuclear as a key tool, linked to the diverse international community working on many challenges for the humanity worldwide, is the way to go. NICE Future, IYNC, IFNEC, WIN are some great examples of how the international community is addressing these challenges. So thanks everyone. I am sorry for not taking all the questions that was posted in the chat. This is the end of our event. Thank you and goodbye.